Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for this lecture. In the 5th century, as we'll see, Celtic Roman Britain was overrun by Teutonic Anglo-Saxon invaders, and according to tradition, King Arthur led the resistance against them and had all sorts of other adventures as well, so we'll hear about him and the extent to which he can be considered an historical figure. St. Augustine of Canterbury is often called the apostle to the English because of his efforts to re-establish Christianity in Britain after this pagan invasion, though many other heroes were also involved in this. St. Bede, known as the Venerable Bede, is the first significant English historian, our primary source for what we know about the history of Britain in the period we'll be covering in the first half of the lecture today, and the first historian to try to date events from the birth of Christ. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons will be won over by Christianity and civilization, and King Alfred will lead them then against a new invasion, this time by the Vikings. And Edward the Confessor is the last king of England before the Norman Conquest, the last successful invasion in the history of the British Isles. In the course of this course, we've had occasion to mention Britain several times. Julius Caesar visited it in 55 BC and again in 54. In the 1st century AD, the Emperor Claudius established the first permanent Roman garrison at Colchester. About 120 AD, Hadrian had the famous wall built, which still bears his name, to protect the then more civilized Britons from their less civilized neighbors in Scotland. Constantine was proclaimed emperor at York in 306. And in his day, delegates went all the way from Britain to the Council of Nicaea, and the progress of Christianity in Britain followed apace. And if we can judge by the Milton Hall treasure dug up near Cambridge in 1946 and now in the British Museum, and the remains of such places as the villa at Fishburn we saw earlier this quarter, some people in Britain were indeed living quite well. Lord Raglan says you can judge how civilized a man is by the number of luxuries he considers necessities, but there's something wrong with a definition according to which my children would be counted among the most civilized people in the world. Kenneth Clark actually doesn't like the Milton Hall treasure. He thinks it smacks of decadence. He thinks the Romanized Britons were civilized all right, but they weren't creative. Clive Bell, a man with whom I agree about few things, makes something like the same point when he says that the measure of a civilized man is not that he is creative, but that he has the ability to appreciate what others have created. He says that savages are always creating things after a fashion, whittling little dolls, stringing baskets together, and so on, but they're not civilized because if, for example, you show Amazon Indians a Rembrandt or a Chinese landscape, they'll be unimpressed. They don't have the civilized man's ability to value things made by others and a fortiori by others from other places and times. That makes some sense to me. I'm reminded of my father, who was a talented enough artist to actually survive without government grants, but had no interest whatever in the history of art, let alone Chinese landscapes or Amazon baskets. He was certainly artistically creative, but by Bell's definition, not, may he rest in peace, very civilized. This is the back of a Celtic mirror made around 100 AD. The Celts were the first group of Indo-Europeans to migrate westward in large numbers across northern Europe, and by the middle of the first millennium they were well established in France, Spain, and Britain. It was essentially against Celts that the Romans were fighting in their subjugation of those areas. The Celts were to be followed westward by the Teutons, the Indo-Europeans who spoke Germanic languages and who stopped or were stopped by the Romans more or less at the Rhine. This is a Celtic shield of about 200 AD, which was dragged out of the Thames near the Battersea Power Station. These Celtic things were made at about the same time as the Mildenhall treasure, but obviously reflect a completely different artistic tradition, which continued to produce impressive things despite Roman influence and occupation. Unfortunately, despite a later reputation for garrulity second to none in their production of a mass of medieval folklore, the Celts of this age wrote absolutely nothing that survives in their native language. So with some reservations, Celtic Britain, the part under Roman rule anyway, was a civilized enough place by the 3rd or 4th century AD, but as the troubles of the more southern part of the empire increased, less attention was paid to northern Europe, and finally in 410, the Emperor Honorius recalled the last of the imperial troops from their British posts and said that the islanders should take steps to defend themselves. The real end of Celto-Roman Britain and the beginning of Anglo-Saxon Britain came about the middle of the 5th century when, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the not very reliable medieval English storyteller, sometimes called an historian, a British leader named Vortigern invited a body of continental mercenaries, mostly Angles and Saxons, to come help the Britons fight off the Picts and other troublemakers. As you can see from this map, the Angles and Saxons were only two of many mostly Teutonic tribes that were moving west and occupying large parts of Europe by this time, the 5th century. Vortigern's mercenaries, the story goes, liked what they saw, brought more of their fellows, and soon proved a greater menace than the northerners they were supposed to fight. In any case, by invitation or not, Teutonic Angles, Saxons, and Jutes did cross the Channel in great numbers in the 5th century. Some Britons retreated into the far west and north, some crossed the Channel to Brittany in such numbers that it was named after them, but most submitted to what soon became the new non-Celtic, non-Roman, non-Christian Teutonic Anglo-Saxon ruling class. According to one of the most famous legends in the world, there was, however, one native Celt, King Arthur, who was born at Tintagel Castle here on the coast of Cornwall, though not much of what you can see here now is older than the 13th or maybe the 12th century, and who did make a stand against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. But those who want to jump from the fact that there may have been someone named Arthur who did fight against the Anglo-Saxons to the conclusion that Malory's Morte d'Arthur is essentially, let alone mostly, a work of history, are up against some problems. In about 570, a monk named Gildas wrote an account of the Anglo-Saxon conquest and doesn't even mention him. Nor, and this is much more serious, does the Venerable Bede, who wrote his History of the English Church and People about 700. Bede is considered our main source for this era, and it's hard to imagine he would have left someone like King Arthur out of his work, were he really an historical figure of any consequence. There are Welsh poems that may be as early as 600 or so, which make reference to Arthur, so if these references are not later additions, they are the earliest we have, but the earliest references which are unanimously accepted are in the work of the 8th century writer Nennius, and essentially all he says is that Arthur fought 12 battles against the invaders. This is another view of Tintagel now. Most of the stories we associate with Arthur go back only at most to the work of the aforementioned Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote around 1150, but it isn't until the 15th century that we get, as it were, the definitive account of Arthur's life and times in the Morte d'Arthur of Thomas Malory, written 1,000 years after the hero was supposed to have lived. Of course, in order to decide whether or not Arthur existed, we would have to decide what X would have to have done to justify our calling him Arthur, and there's room for a lot of argument about this. But I say if X can't include Excalibur, the Lady of the Lake, the Holy Grail, and the Round Table in his resume, then throw the impostor out. But the stories are immortal, and as Winston Churchill says, they're all true, or at least they ought to be. For what it's worth, Mallory says Uther Pendragon made a deal with the magician Merlin to the effect that if the latter could arrange for him to spend the night with Igraine, the wife of the Duke of Tintagel here, the child born of that affair would be turned over to him, and that child was Arthur. There are probably hundreds of places which claim some imagined connection to King Arthur in the British Isles. This is Caerleon in Wales, which claims to have been the home of the Round Table. Well, it is round, isn't it? It's actually the ruin of a Roman theater, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have also held a round table, right? It also is claimed that Arthur was crowned here on about as much evidence as would support the claim he was crowned in my house in Oakland. In the Great Hall of Winchester, there's a nice round table too, that is very old, about 600 or 700 years, but that just means it was made a mere 1,000 years after Arthur is supposed to have eaten dinner at it. The Round Table, in fact, is first mentioned in a poem by the Norman Wace, who wrote in the 12th century, and the Holy Grail is first mentioned by the French writer Chrétien de Troyes, whose hero is Galahad. Other continental writers like Wolfram von Eschenbach, who had Parsifal pursue the Grail, and Gottfried von Strasbourg, who wrote Tristan and Isolde, contributed more legends to the whole Arthurian Apocrypha, which increaseth yet with such works as The Once and Future King, Excalibur, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Cadbury Castle in Somerset near Glastonbury is said by the Blue Guide to England's authors to be the most likely site of Camelot, but what do they mean by that? Do they mean that Chrétien de Troyes, who again is the first to mention it, had this place in mind as Arthur's home? He seems to place it near Caerleon in Wales, as does Geoffrey of Monmouth. Or do they mean, as they seem to, that this is where the King Arthur of Mallory lived, and so be saying something like the North Pole is the most likely home of Santa Claus? Or do they mean it's the most likely home of an historical person named Arthur, in whose biography, were there such a thing, we'd find a high percentage of the adventures later accounts attribute to him? Maybe they mean this, but in lieu of such a biography, we have no evidence anyone named Arthur ever saw this place. In the 12th century, Giraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, reported the finding of what was alleged to be Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury. The sign there says that in 1191 it was said that the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere were found here and were later put in a black marble tomb on this spot that was destroyed in the Reformation. In the so-called Liber Rubeus Bathoniae, an early 15th century life of Arthur, the tomb is said to have been inscribed Hic jacet Arturus quondam rexque futurus. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. Next time we'll hear about St. Anselm's famous proof for the existence of God called the Ontological Argument. And if you think I'm too skeptical about Arthur, I'll try to change your mind now by actually proving his existence. Yes, right before your eyes, or at least your ears, using a version of the Ontological Argument. It goes like this. Guinevere was King Arthur's wife. This is certainly true. If you're on a quiz show and are asked who was King Arthur's wife, Guinevere's the right answer. But you can't have a wife unless you exist. Therefore, King Arthur existed. Well, it's that kind of argument that should make you skeptical of logicians and of the scholastic philosophy of the Middle Ages too, perhaps. The tradition that Arthur was buried at Glastonbury likely arose because it was also believed by many that Joseph of Arimathea had brought here the Holy Grail, the chalice which was used at the Last Supper and or in which Joseph caught some of Christ's blood at the crucifixion. It is believed that he put his staff in the ground here, and from it grew a thorn tree, not the one you see here now, but its presumed ancestor, which the Puritans are said to have used for firewood. Unfortunately, the story about the staff and the thorn tree can only be traced back to the 18th century. In any case, the abbey at Glastonbury was one of the most important in England until it was wrecked in the Reformation. This is a view of more of the church itself, the oldest part of which as it stands was built in 1184. It would have been a much less impressive place at the time of Arthur's presumed burial here. Well, even if Arthur existed, he was a failure, because the island fell completely under the sway of the invading pagan Anglo-Saxons, and as Winston Churchill puts it, a red sunset, a long night settled over Britain. Sir Kenneth says that the Christian Britons had to sort of hold on by their fingernails in places like the Skellig Rocks off the coast of Ireland here, although it wasn't perhaps quite as bad as that. The Anglo-Saxons, in fact, did not reach Ireland, and St. Patrick was doing his work there at just about the time the Anglo-Saxons were overrunning Britain. This is one of the stone huts that made up the rude monastic complex of uncertain date, but possibly as early as the 7th century on Skellig Michael. St. Patrick was in fact born in England, but was taken to Ireland by pirates, whence he escaped to France, and then returned to Ireland to begin his mission in 432. There were by that time already many Christians there, but his work was such as to produce a quantum leap in the success of the new faith. This bell is inscribed with his name, but is said not in fact to be as old as the 5th century. His effect on the Irish was such as to produce a host of legends, which it's now difficult to separate from the truth. But a man doesn't attract legends unless he is himself a powerful figure. He is said, of course, to have driven the snakes out, and more believably to have used the shamrock to explain the threefold unity of the Trinity, and he is said to have converted a king by pounding his staff on the latter's foot. The king, then understanding what it would be like to have a nail through his foot, was moved to immediate conversion. His autobiographical confession is a kind of mini-masterpiece, as is the poem attributed to him called the Lorica, or Breastplate, with the famous refrain, Dominus Salus, Christius Salus, Salus tua Domini sit semper nobiscum. St. David sort of stands to Wales the way Patrick does to Ireland. In the 6th century, he presided over the building of a church here, which many Welsh consider to be, since he was a bishop, the earliest cathedral in England. None of that building survives, however, and the facade of this one is 19th century. In about 565, about the time David was preaching in Wales, St. Columba left Ireland for Scotland to carry on a similar mission. St. Ninian had already founded Whithorn on the Solway Firth in about 397, and many of the Celts in southern Scotland were Christians by the time of Columba's arrival. But the Picts, farther north, who may have been members of a pre-Celtic, as it were, aboriginal people about whom we know little except that they painted or tattooed themselves, were pagans and a challenge, as were the Angles and Saxons too, who were by this time in control of what was already coming to be known after them as Angleland or England. Columba founded the abbeys of Derry and Durrow before leaving Ireland, some say in expiation for some crime. In any case, he converted the Pictish king in Scotland and was given the island of Iona in the Hebrides, on the beach of which he had first landed, and where he had already established a monastery. Until Malcolm Canmore built Dunfermline Abbey and was buried there, almost all the medieval kings of Scotland were buried on Iona, so great did the prestige of St. Columba and his abbey become. It was from Iona that St. Aidan would set out to preach Christianity in northern England and found Lindisfarne, which we'll hear about shortly. It was probably from Iona that St. Willibrord took the Ectornot Gospels on his mission to the continental Saxons, and it is likely that the most famous of all medieval books made in the British Isles, the Book of Kells, was made here as well. And speaking of books, this is a page from the so-called Cathach or Battle Book of St. Columba, which is essentially a psalm book. It was called the Battle Book because it was carried in battle in hopes of encouraging divine help.
It was made in the 6th century, probably, and is both the oldest book now in Ireland. It's in the Dublin Royal Irish Academy, and one of the oldest texts of the Psalms in Latin anywhere. It is said to have been brought to Scotland by St. Columba.
This church now stands where his monastery used to be, but none of this goes back to St. Columba's day. Few parts of this church are earlier than the 16th century, in fact. Kenneth Clark says that when he visited here, he got the feeling that, as he put it, some God is in this place, which is not exactly a Christian sentiment, but like the ancient Greeks who built temples where they felt the gods wanted them, not just where it was convenient for people to have them, so did the Christians often build monasteries where they felt the presence of what Rudolf Otto calls the numinous, where they felt something they were certain of but couldn't define. This is another view of it. I've been referring to Scotland, but it was only really about the time of St. Columba that the Scots began to move from Ireland to what would be known as Scotland. In the 9th century, the Scottish leader Kenneth MacAlpin would defeat the Picts at Cambuskenneth, and the union of the Scots and Picts would create the kingdom of Alba, or Scotia, essentially what we call Scotland today. Among St. Columba's miracles, incidentally, it is recorded that he banished a monster from Loch Ness. This is a page now from the so-called St. Augustine Gospels, said to have been brought by St. Augustine from Rome when he came to England to begin the official papally sponsored re-evangelization of the place following the pagan Anglo-Saxon takeover. This is, of course, St. Augustine of Canterbury, not the earlier St. Augustine of Hippo, about whom we've already heard. According to tradition, St. Gregory, the fellow connected with the development of the liturgy and the music, therefore, once saw some blonde, blue-eyed slaves in Rome and asked what sort of people they were. He was told they were pagan Angles from Angleland, to which he responded, "Oh, not Angles, angels," and he commissioned St. Augustine to go and convert these charming heathens. As Augustine journeyed north, he had some second thoughts, and in effect asked His Holiness if some other post might not be available, say maybe on the Riviera. But St. Gregory persisted, and Augustine finally crossed the Channel, though the Angles he encountered didn't at all look as cute as the ones in Rome. Unexpectedly, St. Augustine found the pagans in Britain to be quite accommodating. King Ethelbert of Kent, though a pagan himself, was married to a Frankish Christian named Bertha and allowed him to proceed with his mission. The Venerable Bede mentions this very church, St. Martin's, which is in fact substantially still a 6th century building, as the place where the first converts assembled before the conversion of Ethelbert himself opened up larger venues to them. This is a closer look at St. Martin's. The tower is 14th century, but you can see the characteristic flat Roman-style bricks and the fabric of the place itself in this closer view. St. Gregory appointed Augustine to be the first Archbishop of Canterbury, the oldest see in Britain, according to all but a few die-hard Welsh holding out for St. David's, and at this writing I think he's now had 99 successors. The abbey which Augustine built and in which he was buried is gone, but some ruins of the rebuilding of it carried out in Norman times do survive, and you see them here. The 11th century foundation of the rotunda, which in effect linked two earlier churches, is clearly visible. And here are more ruins of the Norman abbey. Augustine also sent Paulinus to York, where he converted King Edwin of Northumbria in an episode made memorable by Bede, and the See of York is the second most ancient then in England. Mellitus was sent to be Bishop of London, but he was less successful and was in fact driven out of the city. Augustine also established, as Archbishop of Canterbury, the first cathedral there. And in this picture, you can see the late medieval rebuilding of his church in the distance beyond the ruins of the abbey, again in the foreground. So Augustine is the official apostle to the English then, but some think his influence and accomplishments are less impressive than those of St. Aidan, who is far less well known, but whom Kenneth Clark calls the real apostle to the English. This is a modern statue honoring Aidan at Lindisfarne. He was born in Ireland and spent some time as a monk at Iona before organizing the monastery at Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. He converted King Oswin of Northumbria, at that time the most powerful of the 7 Anglo-Saxon-ruled kingdoms that had eventually been established in Britain by the invaders. Bede is at his best in recounting how Oswin had given Aidan a horse to use in his missionary work, which the saint promptly gave away to the first farmer who needed it. The king complained to St. Aidan about this, but the saint rebuked him for showing a lack of Christian charity. At this, says Bede, they went into dinner, and the bishop sat down in his place. But the king, who had come in from hunting, stood warming himself by the fire, turning over in his mind what the bishop had said, and then suddenly unbuckling his sword and handing it to a servant. He impulsively knelt at the bishop's feet and begged his forgiveness, saying, "I will not refer to this matter again, nor will I inquire how much of our bounty you give away to God's children." The bishop was moved to tears by the humility of the king, stood himself, and raised the king to his feet. Lindisfarne was abandoned during the Viking raids of the 8th century, and the abbey, the ruins of which one sees today, wasn't built until the 11th century. Some stones which are relics of the earlier establishment of Aidan's day are, however, preserved in the local museum. The famous Lindisfarne Gospel Book, which we'll see later, was almost certainly made here, as was the Durham Gospel Book. Here's another view of the ruins with the castle of Lindisfarne in the distance. Both Colman of Lindisfarne and Wilfrid of Lindisfarne were, as you might guess, at one time monks here, before they represented opposing viewpoints at the famous Synod of Whitby, about which we'll hear shortly. St. Cuthbert, who is still widely revered in northern England, was also a monk here, and this actually is part of his coffin, which is now in Durham. When the Viking raids began, as I said, the monks at Lindisfarne moved away from the coast, finally winding up in Durham, carrying the Lindisfarne Gospel Book and the body of St. Cuthbert with them. The 8th century book known as St. Cuthbert's Gospel was found in his coffin, although it was put there apparently sometime after he was. It is considered to be the oldest book in the full modern sense, with its original binding in existence. It contains the Gospel of St. John in Latin and was made at the Abbey of Monkwearmouth Jarrow about the time Codex Amiatinus was made there and about the time the Venerable Bede was there. St. Cuthbert is today buried in this spectacular setting in the great cathedral that was later built at Durham. Now, the practice of the faith which St. Augustine had brought from Rome to Canterbury in southern England differed in some ways which were thought important from that which Aidan brought to the north. In the 150 years since the Anglo-Saxon invasion, insular practice had here and there gotten out of line with the Roman standard. The Irish, Welsh, and Northern English churches found out that, for example, they were celebrating Easter on the wrong day. They were using an unapproved baptismal rite, and the monks were cutting their hair in a style that was considered out of fashion. This is the ruin of the abbey at Whitby, rebuilt in the 12th century, but on the site of the church in which the famous Synod of Whitby took place in 664. This synod was convened by King Oswy of Northumberland, who had murdered Oswin, his predecessor, whom Aidan had converted, so he seems to have been more interested in theoretical than in applied Christianity, I guess. This is another view of Whitby as it looks today. The purpose of this synod was to discuss the differences between the insular and Roman practices. Colman of Lindisfarne defended the native view, appealing to the authority of St. Columba, and Wilfrid of Lindisfarne defended the Roman view, appealing to the authority of St. Peter. The upshot of the debate was that Oswy concluded that since St. Peter holds the keys to the pearly gates, he'd better side with him and the Roman view. So the British Church agreed at least nominally to do things the Pope's way, though many of the clergy went off in a huff about it. While we're at Whitby, we should take note of the fact that at the time of the synod there was a monk here named Cadman, who was something of a poet in the Anglo-Saxon or Old English language. In fact, he is considered to be the earliest known writer of English, not that it would be any easier to read than the Latin into which Bede translated some of his work for most of us. Anglo-Saxon or Old English is as foreign a language as German or Japanese, for that matter, to most of us. As I mentioned earlier, our main source for the history of England up to this time and on through the early 8th century is the history of the English church and people of St. Bede, known as the Venerable Bede. Most of his life was spent as a monk at Wearmouth and Jarrow, and he's buried at Durham, so of course he saw things from a deeply Christian perspective, but it would hardly be fair to criticize someone of his age for that. He is, in fact, the only Englishman in Dante's Paradiso. Incidentally, he is in this later portrait wearing the papally approved hairstyle for monks, the tonsure. In a bit we'll see the British fashion modeled.
This is a text of Bede's history which is almost old enough to be contemporary with him.
One of the things that makes his work interesting is the fact that he is the first major historian to try to date events from the birth of Christ. Back in the 6th century, a Roman monk named Dionysius Exiguus, Dionysius the Short, calculated that Jesus was born in the Roman year 754 AUC ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city, with which event the Roman calendar began, and Bede made that the year 1 Anno Domini. AD doesn't, of course, stand for after death. It stands for in the year of the Lord. It is now widely thought that Jesus could not have been born later than the Roman year 750, so it is often said now that he was born in, say, 4 BC, which admittedly sounds odd, but it's easier to accept that than to try to change all the dates in all the history books of the past 1,000 years. Calendars are far from the simple things we take them to be, however, and there's still a lot of argument over exactly when the Roman calendar year started, as opposed to when the civil year started, whether Jesus was actually born in the winter of one year or the spring of the next, and so on. This is the church at Escombe near Durham, which is one of the few examples of Anglo-Saxon architecture of this era, more or less the 8th century, still surviving. It's more or less contemporary with the Carolingian churches like Germany de Prés and Saints Petrus and Marcellinus, which we've seen. It's not much as a work of art, but it's a venerable relic. Another rare example of early Anglo-Saxon architecture is the Church of St. Lawrence at Bradford-on-Avon. Bede knew St. Aldhelm, who founded this church in about 705, and he calls him the greatest scholar of the day, but Aldhelm is now mostly known for a very opaque Latin style and for riddles sort of on the model of what's black and white and red all over, or how many Visigoths does it take to screw in a light bulb. Interesting as these old churches are as relics of early Christian Britain, many would say that the most important contributions the British Isles made to the history of civilization in this period, or at least to the history of art in this period, are the illuminated manuscripts, especially those thought to have been painted at Iona and Lindisfarne. This is a page of the Durham Gospel, probably painted at Lindisfarne around 650, and taken to Durham at the time of the Viking raids. It is, though only a few pages of it survive, often considered the earliest example of the typical style, sometimes called insular, sometimes Celtic, sometimes Hiberno-Saxon, sometimes Anglo-Saxon. Kenneth Clark says we really don't know by whom, where, or exactly when any of these manuscripts were made. but it's likely the most famous ones, at least, were made in what's now England or Scotland, not Ireland. This is a detail from that page. Thomas Cahill, in about as irresponsible a piece of tabloid pseudo-scholarship as has ever become a bestseller, How the Irish Saved Civilization, essentially gives the Irish credit for the whole greatness of this style. However, since he also claims that the Irish single-handedly saved civilization from barbarism, you should be a little suspicious. Go Irish, we're number one is an attitude that's more appropriate to a football game than a discussion of European civilization. There's blarney on every page. This is a page from the Book of Durrow, now in the Trinity College Library, Dublin, but probably made somewhat later, maybe 680 or so at Iona, and taken to Durrow in Ireland during the Viking raids. It's more complete and more completely decorated than the Book of Durham, so it's sometimes called the earliest in the style. None of these books are Bibles. They typically contain the Gospels in the Vulgate Latin, along with various commentaries. Obviously, many scribes worked on the pages of any given book in this style. It was considered that it would take one man, more or less a year just to make a copy of the Bible without illumination. And these books, many of which are at least close to Bible size, aren't of course just text. They are filled, as we'll see, with some of the most intricate decoration ever devised. This is the symbol of Matthew, the man at the beginning of his gospel in the Book of Durrow. One of the things that is most characteristic of this style, which is perhaps best just to call insular, referring to the British Isles as a whole, is the lack of importance given to the human figure. Throughout the history of painting in Europe before the 20th century, there have been very few major periods in which the human figure has been so neglected. This fellow is a man, but he is so stylized that you wouldn't learn much about the appearance of human beings from him if you didn't already know what they looked like. You should also notice his haircut, which is in the style approved for monks by the Insular Church before the Synod of Whitby. This is a page from the Echternach Gospels, which were probably made at Iona and taken by St. Willibrord when he left to begin his lifelong missionary work on the continent. It's named for the famous monastery he established at Echternach in Luxembourg, and it's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The great Abbey of Fulda in Germany, one of the great centers of learning in Europe for centuries, was established by another Englishman, St. Boniface, who was a friend of Willibrord's, and Alcuin of York, about whom we heard in connection with Charlemagne, was related to him. Here's the man at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew in this book, and this painter has taken the precaution of telling you that this is in fact imago hominis, the picture of a man, in case you didn't get it. In his book, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon Painting, Carl Nordenfalk calls this the finest single page of the whole style. It's the lion, the symbol of St. Mark, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark in the Echternach Gospels. Whether or not you agree with Nordenfalk about that being the finest single page, there are two books which as a whole are usually put at the head of the insular style. One is the Book of Kells, which we'll see in a bit, and the other is the Lindisfarne Gospel Book. It is thought to have been made at Lindisfarne, taken to Durham, and is now in the British Museum. What you see here is the first page of the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll go on to hear more about this book after the break.